The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Recording going on my end. Okay, and we're ready to go in 3, 2, 1. And we say hello to Dennis Kucinich, served as mayor of Cleveland from 1977 to 1979, later as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He also sought the Democratic nomination for president in 2004 and 2008, and now is the author of a new book, The Division of Light and Power. Dennis Kucinich, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you. We do appreciate your time as well. And, you know, this is a story about your fight against privatizing Cleveland's city-owned power system. This happened back in the late 70s when you were mayor. So boiling it down to broad themes, remind us briefly what that fight was all about.
Well, in a nutshell, it was about a private utility monopoly, an investor-owned utility, which engaged in corporate espionage, sabotage, interfering in the internal affairs of the city of Cleveland in order to try to force the city to sell its municipal electric system to them so they could have a bigger monopoly. I mean, that was the core of the battle, but as the book is outlined, it's a lot more than that.
Now, your decision to block the sale of the city's power plant set off a fierce battle involving some tactics on the part of those pushing you to sell the power system. There was even an assassination attempt on you. How do you understand why your opponents would go so far?
There's a lot of money on the line. I mean, you know, I'm talking to you from Cleveland, Ohio, a home that I've lived in for 50 years. And just over my shoulder here was a high-powered rifle shot was fired, missed me by a fraction of an inch. And, you know, I was at that point when that happened, leading the effort to block the sale. And I was the only person leading that effort to block the sale. So I never discussed when I was in office the safety issues. But later on, a NBC investigative reporter for Cleveland interviewed a convicted hitman who said, yeah, he would have taken the job, except he was picked up and he wanted 80 grand at that point. This was, 40 some years ago. And that the reason was because, this is quoting him, we couldn't buy Kucinich. That's what I was told, he said. There was an attempt to, there was an assassination plot that was supposed to unfold in October of 1978, according to a U.S. subcommittee on organized crime. It was their report that said that there was a plan to take a shot at me in a parade on Cleveland's east side. And I think, and the reason why I wasn't in the parade is that I was struck with a bleeding ulcer just as I was getting ready to go to the event, and I was rushed to the hospital, and so that attempt was scuttled. And then there are other stories that are in the book about the dangers, but I just want to stress that I never discussed that when I was in office because I didn't want it to become a distraction. And I can certainly tell you that, as far as my commitments, I wasn't going to be dissuaded because somebody was threatening me. I just don't work that way. So but a police intelligence officer, Lieutenant Ed Kovacic, was interviewed on television. He came and told me personally, He said, you know, it's about the light system. Some people, you're stopping people from making a lot of money.
Wow. Now, eventually the city was thrown into default as you continued to block the sale. And this came at a political cost to you in the next mayoral race, which you lost to George Voinovich. You anticipated this fight could come at a cost. Why was this a fight you had to take on, even at the expense of your political career?
Because it matters what people pay for electricity. It matters that people have control over their own destiny. It matters that that decisions are dictated to cities by corporations. You know, I was thinking when I was told by the head of the biggest bank in the state of Ohio and one of the 33rd largest bank in the U.S. that either I sell the electric system to the utility in which the bank was a business partner, or they were going to renew the city's credit on loans that I hadn't even taken out. They were going to push the city into default. And when that discussion was going on, I was thinking of my parents counting pennies on an old metal table when I was a kid. They're counting pennies late at night, trying to come up with enough money to pay an electric bill. I mean, you know, these memories are very powerful, and they do have a motivating influence in any of our decision making. And so I was influenced by that. I thought about not just my parents, but of people across the city for whom it matters what they paid for electricity. And if they could get a break on their electric bill, in this case at that time, Munilight was 20% cheaper, then who was I to tell some monopoly that, well, yeah, you can have it because, if I don't give it to you, you're going to punish me. My feeling was I wasn't there for them. I was there for the people. We saved the system. The people voted. Check this out. The people voted for a tax to pay off the debts that I hadn't even incurred. The tax passed. The banks had said that if I put the tax on a ballot and it passed, they'd take the city out of default. Even after it passed, they wouldn't take the city out of default. This was a political game that was being played to actually, it's a coup of sorts to knock out an elected leader. And see, this story, nothing like this has ever been told before in America. It doesn't mean it's never happened, but the story's never been told before, and it becomes relevant today because of the role that money plays in our political process. You know, when I was going to grade school, they had civics classes. You see the box with the executive, legislative, judicial branch. Well, today, if it was taught, you'd have another box that would put a dollar sign on it, and in some cases that would go above those tripartite branches. So I had to stand for something, and you either stand for something or you kneel.
Yeah, and we could use a lot more of that nowadays, as a matter of fact. We're speaking to Dennis Kucinich, who served as mayor of Cleveland from 77 to 79, later, of course, as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And he is the author of a new book, The Division of Light and Power. And Dennis, of course, the story doesn't end with Cleveland in default and you losing an election. In 1996, you were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and then reelected 7 times. So what changed?
What changed is that the people of Cleveland understood that I put my career on the line for them. And that in 1993, there was an announcement that the system, which I saved, was expanding, that more people would be able to get cheaper electricity. And it wasn't just the ratepayers were saving, taxpayers were saving, because the city handles street lighting, 76 facilities. So the city was going to save more money. And suddenly there was an awareness that I saved the city, at that point, hundreds of millions of dollars with the decision. So, I was working on another draft of the book. I was in California at a friend's house when I got the call about this renaissance of public power in Cleveland. And what happened from that moment on, people were saying, well, wait a minute, Dennis was right. He put his career on the line. And so I was elected to the state Senate on a slogan said, because it was right. And then I was elected to the United States Congress for the first of 8 terms. The first slogan was light up Congress. people remember. And in the city of Cleveland, every election I was in, I piled up big majorities in Cleveland because people remembered and they appreciated that I was willing to take a stand. So I have a pretty good constituency here still. And, I never knew that I'd ever have a chance at a political comeback. When I made that decision not to sell, the chances were that my career was over. And I knew that. And it's not like I'm not a martyr, but it's a question of, and I think anybody who reads the book is going to find this, what are you willing to do to stand up for what you believe in?
It comes down to principles, right? I mean, you stand for, you believe in something, you've got to stick with that belief, unless somebody can sway you otherwise. But
if I may, this is not just about one person in one city. This is about the question of democratic governance and if it actually exists today in America, and particularly at a local level. So anybody reading this book, this book is a guide to questions that need to be asked in communities across the country, and an encouragement for those who want to take a stand, and shows you how to do it. And it raises the question of who actually rules the community. Where's City Hall? Is it just a building that everybody goes to, or is City Hall in the boardrooms of the banks, the utilities, and in Cleveland's case, the mob? I mean, these are questions that are raised, and they're even more relevant today than they were then because the stakes are higher today.
And I'm glad you brought it up because it is a fascinating story, in and of itself, but it does carry plenty of relevance to today's battles over public and state ownership of essential services. Texas comes to mind right now after the horrible winter, the issues that they have with their power grid.
But ERCOT knew 10 years earlier that they had to make improvements on the power grid, and they didn't want to spend the money. I mean, bottom line, they would not spend the money. So as a consequence, you get this storm in Texas, and suddenly millions of people are left without electricity and all the other services that are connected to electricity. And, this is why people must be involved. This is why this book is relevant, because it shows you what happens when the public doesn't really have control over their own lives, and these utilities are calling the shots. It also shows that in Texas' case, the isolation that has occurred, where you're not connected to the national grid. And what's the interesting parallel with Cleveland is that the private utility monopoly stopped our municipal electric system from being connected to the national grid, so we'd have greater reliability. Now, I know there's ideological reasons that people don't want to be connected to, America's energy grid. I understand that, but I can also say that that these decisions that are made that affect our lives, sometimes in a very personal and real way, need to be looked at, and people need to have a chance to get educated about it. And I assume that in Texas in particular, people got more of an education than ever wanted on utilities.
Well, that's just it. I mean, after the fact, you have people saying, who do we call? Who do we call? Well, you wouldn't have to call anybody if it wasn't a private ownership situation. If the government is there to help you out, they can help you out. But when you decide to just walk away, you get what you pay for.
Well, Texas is a very important case in point. You go back to Enron and the kind of crooked thinking that went into that whole enterprise. And, anybody that has control over energy, whatever the form it takes, ultimately, if the people do not have control, mayor of Cleveland over 100 years ago, the person who actually created the municipal electric system in Cleveland, his name was Tom Johnson. He said that I believe in municipal ownership of all public service facilities because if you do not own them, they will in time own you. They'll corrupt your institute. They'll corrupt your politics, rule your institutions, and finally destroy your liberties. He said that 110 years ago. It's true today.
And Dennis, there is another theme throughout the book, and it's about standing up for the right thing as a politician. And that's basically what you were doing as the mayor in Cleveland. On that count, what would be your advice to a young person just getting started in a political career?
Don't sell out. Don't Don't think that the only way you can get involved in politics is to give your soul to some interest group so you can become their pawn. This is at the very beginning. Be very careful about the relationships that you make, and be careful about the commitments that you make, because once you get in there, you're going to be very, very hamstrung if you told someone, well, you'll take care of this for them or that for them. I mean, everything about politics today is transactional. You do this for me, I'll do this for you. Doesn't have to be that way. So, number one, go directly to the people. Number two, don't think you have to go through any brokerage in order to approach the people. Don't ask for permission to run. And number three, raise money in as broad a way as you can. Don't take money from just one individual, because it could be hazardous. Sometimes that individual could be clean as a driven snow. Fine. But that's unusual. And be true to yourself. Stand up for what you believe in. And don't be afraid to step forward. I think this is probably the toughest thing for anybody who's just starting in politics. What's that first step? When you step forward, everyone else is silent. When you speak your truth, the writer Emerson, in another century ago, talked about going to a lecture and hearing the speaker's words come back to him with what he described as an alienated majesty. He said, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string." To believe that what's true for you could be true for others as well. So each of us has to trust that inner compass that we have that'll take us in a direction towards the fulfillment of our purpose. And it's important for young people to get into politics, but young people can become old very quickly if they sell out. And that's, something that always has to be kept in mind. It's not just about, well, if we elect somebody younger, if we elect women, look, this is about human nature. And it's also about those who aspire to office to know that you don't have to sell out. And it changes your life when it's a little bit tougher. I will grant you that, as somebody who walked that path. It's the road less traveled. However, you own your own soul. And there is something to that.
Absolutely. And you can sleep at night as well. The name of the book, The Division of Light and Power, the author, former Ohio Congressman Dennis Kucinich, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dennis, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to do it again sometime soon.
This is a very documented story. This isn't, and that's the power of it. This is all true. So thank you for the opportunity. And the book goes on sale, by the way, on June the 8th.
Fantastic. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Bye now.
Goodbye now. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And we say hello to Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way and former president of the NAACP. Ben Jealous, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. Shortly after the verdict was announced finding Derek Chauvin guilty on 3 counts in the killing of George Floyd, you wrote in an op-ed about a sense of incomplete relief. Why incomplete?
And we got accountability that day, but we still haven't achieved justice. We've got to make sure that George Floyd's daughter can grow up assured that she's safer than her father was. We've seen from the police killings, one after the other, innocent civilians being killed by the police, unarmed civilians being killed by the police again and again, even on the day that the verdict came down. We have a long way to go in this country.
Mm-hmm. You and many other leaders from the civil rights community have drawn our attention to the need to rethink public safety. One of the ideas you emphasize is the need to challenge the practice of authoritarian policing. How does this misuse of authority by police interfere with genuine public safety?
I mean, so many ways. The first is that authoritarian policing, authoritarian officers being recruited to police endangers all of us. We forget that in between Philando Castile and George Floyd in Minneapolis, a white woman was killed by a black officer. Why was she killed? Because she was not responsive to his questions and she moved sporadically. Why was she not responsive and moved sporadically? Because she was having an epileptic seizure. Did he open the door to help her out medically? No, he shot her through the windshield. He shot her through the windshield. She was having an epileptic seizure, but she moved in a quick and suspicious way, and she did not, obey his commands. You don't obey, you get killed. And sure, Black folks, we are disproportionately the ones who get killed. We're the canaries in the coal mine. Ultimately, what gets the canary can kill everybody. And we've seen that in Minneapolis. We've seen it in many other places. Turns out that if you want to change that situation, you have to change who you recruit. The city of Ithaca, New York, years ago, even before the most recent reforms, years ago said, in addition to testing basic psychological fitness, physical fitness, have you been certified? Have you gone through the course of the academy? We're also going to test how authoritarian you are. If you're too authoritarian, we're not going to hire you. Why'd they do that? Because of a researcher named Phil Goff, who used to be at UCLA, now he's at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the SUNY system, did a bunch of research and found that the officers who rate high on implicit bias but low on authoritarianism are very unlikely to kill you. They're racist, but they're chill. They're unlikely to kill you. The guy's kind of uptight. The guy ranks high in authoritarianism, but he has like a rainbow of friends, maybe even a rainbow of ex-girlfriends. He'll kill you very quickly. And so for 7 years, they've done this authoritarian test up in Ithaca on their officers. This is where Cornell University is. 75% of the officers who pass every other type of fitness, the usual battery of fitness exams for police officers in America, 75% of them fail the authoritarianism test. Why is that? Well, anecdotally, you talk to school teachers, as I have, in community after community, who are at the funeral for one of their former students who's been killed, unarmed and killed by the police. White teachers, Black teachers will tell you the same thing. When they go down to the station house, they don't see a whole lot of bullies. They see a whole lot of kids who are bullied. Those kids have guns and they're in charge. And you better do what they'll say, do what they say, or they might just kill you.
Mm-hmm. You've also written and spoken about the need to build a public safety system that represents who we are today and not one that takes us back to the worst eras in our history. And it's hard not to imagine that we haven't taken several steps backwards, especially recently. How does this history influence the way policing has played out in recent years?
On my dad's side, I descend from 6 officers and 1 drummer boy in the Massachusetts Regiment of the Revolutionary Army, of the Continental Army. My mom's side, I descend from Thomas Jefferson's grandmother. When you look at policing, our policing descends either from the old redcoats, from the British colonial forces, or some areas, Vermont, New Orleans, maybe the French colonial forces, or from slave patrols, like those that would capture my ancestors trying to escape from Jefferson's grandmother's plantation, because her grandchildren were also her slaves. And the culture gets handed down no matter what the course is at the academy. The culture eats policy for lunch every day. You ever seen Denzel Washington's movie Training Day? You have an insight into certainly how the worst officers are trained, but what's common is, for example, on when to use force. when to escalate it, how to de-escalate it so you don't have the situation, de-escalate the situation so you don't have to use force. When is that training done in England where 90% of officers don't carry a gun? It's done every 6 months. It's done at the station house, or they're brought to a training center. And in America, when is it done? It's done on one day. Now, every single jurisdiction in America is allowed to have their own use of force training standards and their own use of force standards. In England, it's one for the entire country, as it is in every other Western democracy. But America, it's super federalized, balkanized, and idiosyncratic. And the most common standard for American police departments is you are trained one day at the academy, 8 hours, 9 to 5. That's it. Never updated, never refreshed. That's how you end up with an officer who can mistake their gun for a taser because they're not put through that stress testing, that training again. In England, where they don't carry guns, they do it every 6 months. Here in America, one day at the academy. And then, as the Denzel Washington movie reminds us, it's training day. And so you're actually not trained at the academy. You're trained by fellow officers who hand down tradition. And the tradition when it comes to policing Black communities is one of completely unnecessary violence that tears the fabric of trust between the community and the police, makes us all more endangered in the process. It also creates this memory muscle in officers that, I don't know how you feel, Jim, but as a Black guy with a white dad and white uncles and white cousins, like when I hear them say, well, in Minnesota, if Black men are 4 times more likely to be killed by the police than white men, it does occur to me that they're killing a hell of a lot of white men.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot more white guys and Black guys in Minnesota.
Right.
So discrepancy does not mean that white men are safe.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, when you look at the numbers, that would certainly suggest that. We're speaking to Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way and former president of the NAACP. And I'm thinking about what you just talked about with the training and what goes on in England, for instance, and in other European countries. You're not going to mistake a cell phone for a gun. You're not going to mistake an epileptic fit for something else. And it's just amazing to me that it's one and done as far as that type of training goes. And that's seriously something wrong with the system. You've also pointed out that meaningful reform of policing in America won't just come from federal action, such as the George Floyd and Policing Act. What are both the possibilities and limits of this bill?
Possibilities for this bill is that it does improve how officers are trained. It does improve overall policy governing policing in America. The limits are it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't transform us to a system where you have one standard for use of force. You have one standard for use of force training. Ultimately, policing in America will have to be reformed from the bottom up. President Obama is correct on that. President Obama and I first crossed paths when he was a state senator trying to end the practice of torturing defendants in Chicago to get confessions out of them. And I was working for Amnesty International USA. And of course, we're an anti-torture organization. And what he understood then, and we understood, is that to end torture in American policing, you actually have to end it department by department by department. And so it is with abusive policing of all sorts. Again, every department in America is allowed to have their own use of force standard, their own use of force training standard. And so what's the good news in that? Well, the good news in that is twofold. One, it means that you, whoever you are, wherever you are, can do a lot to make your community safer, because if you can just get consensus, as they did in Ithaca, New York recently, amongst your city council to transform policing, say to a civilian-led public safety department, where they employ both social workers to deal, say, with homeless and other groups that really need frontline social workers, and then police officers to deal with the most serious safety issues. You can transform your entire world. You don't have to wait for Congress, to wait for the federal government. Mitch McConnell doesn't get a vote on your local police department. So that's good news. The other good news is that while America has well over 10,000 counties, I forget how many, 12,000, 15,000, but well over 10,000 counties, there's only about 500 or 600 where 80% of Black people live. And so we change policing. If the movement's about Black Lives Matter, if you will, if changing the policing of Black folks will ultimately make us all safer, then we only have to change about 5% of the counties or less in the country. And we will have protected more than 80% of the Black lives. We would have, frankly, protected more than 60% of American lives in general. Americans are increasingly concentrated into cities and near suburbs. So the good news is that, you can do a lot in your local community. And the other good news is that it can add up very quickly for the nation as a whole.
Well, and you pointed out, Ben, in that op-ed in The Hill, that change at the local level is a huge job. Over 12,000 police departments in the U.S. How do we begin? Where do we start?
You start in your local community. Again, whoever you are, wherever you are, you have a lot of power. Ithaca, New York, third day of the Derek Chauvin trial, voted to replace their police department with a civilian-led public safety department, gave that department the power to replace through attrition, not firing anybody, but as a college town, this is where Cornell University is. They do a lot of training of officers. Officers pass through there in their career on the way to Rochester or New York City, for example. So they have a lot of attrition. And through attrition, they'll replace up to half the officers with uniformed, unarmed social workers. I'm not saying that that's the one-size-fits-all model for every jurisdiction in America. What I am saying is that what they did, any community can do, which is to push pause on the inertia from the British colonial army or the inertia from slave patrols and say, in this 21st century America, about to be 250 years old, multiracial democracy, what do we need right now to keep us all safe? And then design that. That's the power of what Ithaca did. That's what we can do in every community. That's what we must do.
Is it more important at the local level than at the federal level for meaningful change?
Yes. Yes. The bottom line is yes. The nice thing about federal change is that we can all do it together. We can get it done. We can move things forward. What is not happening at the federal level is a wholesale nationalization of our policing, like making us like England or France. If if that was on the table, wow, that could transform things. We would have one set of rules. We could, govern them as a nation. That's likely where we need to get to. But assuming that that's not happening and that the federal government is essentially just sort of changing the contours, nibbling around the edges, look, the wholesale change that America needs is going to come from local changes to local departments, because every department is ultimately local.
Okay. Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way, former president of the NAACP, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Ben, appreciate your time and love to have you back again soon.
Anytime, brother. Always been to be with you, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Erica Payne, founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires. Recently, she is co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. Erica Payne, thanks very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. Now, tell me about your new book and your involvement with patriotic millionaires.
Sure. So the new book is called Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. We wrote this book after working on tax policy for coming up on 11 years. In 2010, during the lame duck session of Congress, it became pretty clear that President Obama was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts. And that was really infuriating to a group of us. So I got a bunch of millionaires to sign a letter basically saying, for the good of the country, raise our taxes. And the message really exploded in the media. The idea that a bunch of millionaires wanted to pay higher taxes was shocking to the media and to the public. And we've been working together ever since to try to correct the egregious wrong that is our tax code.
Your book is a deep dive into how the current tax code is at the expense of working people. Tell us about that.
Basically, about 70% of Americans think the economy is rigged against them. And they are right. The economy is rigged against ordinary Americans. And then the question is, okay, how do you rig an economy? Well, the best first place to start to rig an economy is through the tax code. And what we have created within this country now is a tax code that virtually guarantees that we will become more unequal even more quickly over time. So right now, America is suffering from destabilizing historic levels of inequality. We're at the highest level of inequality we have been at in 100 years. And that inequality is the root cause of social unrest. Throughout history, when inequality gets to a certain level, you can almost predict and guarantee that social unrest will follow. So anybody who looks around, whatever political persuasion you are, you can look around and say something has gone wrong in America. People are just not happy. They're not getting along with each other. Well, what is the underlying root cause of that? The root cause of that is a dynamic whereby a very small number of people are getting enormously rich, and they're getting enormously rich at the expense of everyone else.
Well, and we're living in a time of great inequality in terms of both wealth and income. How does a tax code that favors the rich make that worse?
We've created an economy where if you make money off of your money, you end the year richer than if you make money off of work. Let me give you a little more detail of that. So in the book, one of the core points in the book is the differentiation between how ordinary income that people get from a job is taxed as compared to how income from investments is taxed. And so we compare two couples, the work hearts and the slumps. The work hearts go to work all year long, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. The slumps are already rich, so they hang out, drink strawberry daiquiris on the beach. What happens when they make money? So the working people, say they make $100,000 combined income. They go to their jobs, they come home, they get a paycheck. They make $100,000. After their standard deduction, they pay around a little less than $9,000 in taxes. In contrast, the slumps who have been drinking strawberry daiquiris, sitting on the beach all day, playing golf, if they sell $100,000 worth of stock that they own, so their income is also $100,000, but it's from the work of pushing a button on an E-Trade account, they will pay $0 in taxes on that money. So they made a capital gain. Capital gains are taxed at about half the rate of ordinary income. So here on one side, we have the work hearts working hard, the slumps drinking strawberry daiquiris, playing golf. And even if those two couples make the exact same amount of money, one by working, one by selling off some stocks, the work hearts end every year $9,000 poorer than the slumps. So that's the beginning of what basically our entire tax code is designed to do. It is designed to make sure that the rich get richer and everybody else is left holding the bag. And tax policy is so complicated that it's sort of, I think people feel like this is happening. They kind of generally know that this is happening, but they don't understand the specifics of it. So we wrote this book so ordinary people without accounting degrees could figure out what in the world has gone wrong in America. And one of the big things that has gone wrong is that we have been appeasing multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations for decades. And we have left middle class and working class Americans holding the bag for keeping this country running, and it has to stop.
We're speaking with Erica Payne, founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires. Recently, she is co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. And Erica, it's not uncommon to hear rich people say they are job creators, so they deserve a tax break. But what's wrong with that argument?
Well, the central thing that's wrong with the argument is that it's dumb and it's wrong, and it's been proven to be wrong over and over and over again, and it doesn't stop them from using it. And it's one of the things that makes me the craziest about this whole conversation. The rich in this country basically set out this narrative that is, if you ask me to do anything reasonable, I will take all of my marbles and go home, and you will be left destitute. The job creator argument is one of the ones that they lean into on this. I'll give you some examples, right? Randall Stevenson, who's the former CEO of AT&T, in 2017, when Republicans rewrote the entire federal tax code, Randall Stevenson ran all over the country, insisting that the correlation between tax cuts for corporations and job creation was, quote, very, very tight. Well, during the time period from 2008 to 2015, AT&T's effective corporate tax rate was around 8%. That was well below the statutory rate at the time of 35%. So according to Mr. Stevenson's logic, during that period of time, you would have assumed that AT&T had hired a number of people given that 8% tax rate. Well, during that time, they laid off 40,000 people. After the tax cut was passed, after the millionaire tax cut was passed in 2017, and corporations went from 35% to 21% while keeping all of the loopholes and shenanigans that they had in there before. AT&T the following year laid off another 40,000 people. And so even these titan heads of industry, want to pay lower taxes, and they don't care if they have to lie to the people in the country in order to do it. Randall Stevenson, bald-faced, lied to the American people when he said that tax cuts are a job creator. They are not a job creator. And they use that as an excuse to get out of their obligation for doing what they need to do for the country. The only job creator in the world is consumer demand. Okay. So even if you look at a company like Apple doesn't make money because of its investors. It makes money because people line up around the corner to buy iPhones and computers and every other kind of product. If you don't have those people standing in line, then you don't have any people who have to help those people find the right computer or iPhone for them. The consumers themselves are the job creators. And that makes it particularly perverse what we are doing and creating this level of inequality, because we're essentially killing our customer base. When we take more and more money from the bottom and pile it on the top, we are limiting the fluid dollars that people will spend to generate job creation. And we're doing it in order to benefit a tiny number of people. And in the words of my friend Ben Cohen, who's the co-founder of Ben & Jerry's, there's only so much chunky monkey one rich guy can eat.
And what is the role of politics in all of this? I mean, on the one hand, we could understand how a fair taxes position could play across voting lines. But even if it did, would that be enough to counteract the interest of big donors who are funding campaigns?
I think that it largely is not. It has not proven to date to be enough. Taxing multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations is wildly popular with the American public across party lines. the vast majority of Democrats and independents, as well as the majority of Republicans, believe rich people in this country should pay substantially higher taxes. The only people who disagree with that incredibly unremarkable notion are the lawmakers in charge and the people who fund their campaigns. Let me give you a case in point. David Koch, after the 2017 rewrite of the entire federal tax code, Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House at the time, was in charge of that. When the day, it was like the day or the week after that, that tax rewrite passed, David Koch, the Koch brothers, sent Paul Ryan $500,000 to his leadership PAC. They then pledged $20 million to go sell the American people on this crappy deal. They did it by running a job creators bus tour. So they're leaning into that branding. The Koch brothers are estimated to have saved upward of $1.5 billion from that rewrite of the federal tax code. So they invest $20 million in a tour, $500,000 to the people who sold out America, sold out their fellow citizens, and handed the store to a rich billionaire. And that rich billionaire stands to benefit $1.5 billion.
And if there was political will, what's on the top of your list to change the tax system?
So there are a couple of things that we need to do immediately. One is we need to equalize ordinary income and capital gains tax rates for any income over $1 million. This is something I want to be clear to. The patriotic millionaires focus only on taxing people with incomes of $1 million or wealth of $5 million or more. We actually disagree with the Biden administration, who is saying that they are comfortable raising taxes on people over 400,000. We believe that number should be $1 million. Let's start with $1 million. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to equalize ordinary income and capital gains rates over $1 million. There are then a series of loopholes that we need to address. There's a thing called the 1031 exchange, which basically allows rich real estate developers to build enormous portfolios of real estate assets, pass them on to their heirs, and basically never pay a single thing in taxes. There's a loophole called the stepped up basis, which is one of the pieces that we may be able to get fixed in this upcoming tax reform debate that's happening in Washington. The stepped up basis is this thing where basically if you die and leave your assets to your heirs, any increase in the value is eliminated for tax purposes. And so basically you can pass on huge assets to your heirs tax-free. A couple of things that aren't likely to happen but need to happen over the long term are a very substantial wealth tax. Right now, the only people in the country who pay wealth taxes are people who own homes, and they only pay wealth taxes on those homes. Rich people may own multiple homes, but they hold most of their assets in other things like art, antique coin collections, privately held businesses, stock portfolios, things like that. So the only people currently paying a wealth tax are working people who own their home. Billionaires don't typically pay much of a wealth tax because they keep their money in other places other than their home. And so the only people carrying that are working class people. And we need to change that. We need to institute a very substantial wealth tax. There are a couple of other things that we talk about in the book, but those are some of the big chunks that we would really like to see achieved in this iteration. There's a big debate happening in Washington about how to pay for the kind of infrastructure we need to support the kind of country we want to have. We think 100% of that money should come from multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations is to do it.
Mm-hmm. And when we don't pay our fair share, does that undermine public faith in the whole tax system, even in government itself?
Well, 100%. Listen, everybody can look around and see that Jeff Bezos is going into space, and then he has the audacity and bad taste to thank the Amazon employees who work under extremely difficult circumstances. And he's basically sucking the money that they are making for him away from them and using it to buy himself a little rocket ship to go up to the moon. I just think the whole thing is gross, frankly. And Jeff Bezos pays, there was a ProPublica report that came out about the effective tax rate of most of these millionaires and billionaires. I mean, the vast majority of millionaires and billionaires pay nothing as a percentage of their income compared to what working people make. And in 2017, as I've said, the Republicans rewrote the entire federal tax code. In 2018, for the first time in American history, billionaires paid a lower effective tax rate than every other group of people in the country. And so, I mean, you look at people just getting away with murder. It's like any sort of social circumstance. If you see people getting special treatment, getting privileges that are not extended to other people, and these are people who have every amount of privilege already in the world, it just has to end. It's undermining the entire system, and you can see that again in all of the social unrest that's happening across the country.
Absolutely. Erica Payne, founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires, co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Erica, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your time. We'd love to do it again soon.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.